You are listening to an exclusive interview on Bass Musician Magazine. The interview starts now.
Hey everybody, this is Raul for Bass Musician Magazine, and today we have the great honor and pleasure of chatting with bassist Robert Miller of Robert Miller's Project Grand Slam. Welcome to Bass Musician Magazine, Robert.
Thank you, Raul.
As always, we like to get to know you a little bit, and so people kind of get your background. So we'll take a step back. Tell us a little bit. How did you get started on bass?
Sure. Again, thank you very much for having me. I'm a big fan of Bass Musician Magazine, and so it's a big honor for me to be here. I started playing music when I was very, very young. My father was a musician. My father played trumpet. Not a trained musician, but a musician that played most every weekend, weddings and private events like that. And when I was born, my parents basically said, you're going to learn how to play an instrument, whether you like it or not. They started me out on piano when I was about 5 years old. Wasn't crazy about piano. I mean, at 5, I don't think you'd be crazy about anything. When I was about 7, they said, okay, if you don't like piano, what would you like to play instead? And I chose trumpet because that's what my father played. And I played the trumpet pretty seriously. I studied with a fellow who was the first trumpet at Radio City Music Hall's orchestra. And I played trumpet throughout junior high and high school, classical music and the band and stuff like that. And then a little thing happened overseas. This little group from Liverpool came on the scene. And very suddenly, it was not very cool to be playing trumpet any longer. So, like a lot of kids at that time, I taught myself how to play the guitar, 2 or 3 or 4 chords. And I put together a little band, if you will. Mm-hmm. None of us had any real instruments. We all had acoustic guitars. And to make them electric, we all had these little reel-to-reel tape recorders that had a microphone that went along with it. We used to literally scotch tape the microphone onto the body of the guitar, and that was our, quote, electric guitar. But we found out when we bought the sheet music that, the Beatles and other groups, they had regular guitars, and they had this other instrument called the bass guitar. And my friends were struggling just to learn the treble clef. Mm-hmm. I already knew the treble clef from trumpet, so I volunteered to learn the bass clef. And that's the entire reason why I became a bass player, because I knew the treble clef already, and I volunteered to learn the bass clef. So that started when I was about an early teenager and been playing the bass ever since.
After you got that initial inspiration, did you follow with formal studies, or has it been on-the-job kind of progress?
The only formal education that I had, other than playing the trumpet, there was a period in my life, up until I was about 19 or 20 years old, I only played rock and roll. Mm-hmm. And it was all the stuff that was on the radio. And the summer of when I was 19, I took a course in a university in the New York area where I'm from. And part of the music course was that they set you up with a private teacher. And lo and behold, who did they set me up with but a guy named Jimmy Garrison? So for any of you that are watching that don't know Jimmy Garrison, he's one of the greats of all time, played with John Coltrane. Mm-hmm. And so he was my teacher, my private teacher. And he taught me the key elements of jazz, how to do a walking line, for example, on the bass, and got me into thinking beyond just rock and roll. And after the summer passed, I decided I was going to go back to college, and I was going to college in Boston. And he set me up with a couple of people to get in touch with when I went back to Boston, one of whom was a guy that had just come over recently from South Africa to play drums named Anton Fig, who went on to be on the Letterman show for many, many years. But at that time, all the great musicians that were playing in the United States that passed through Boston all kind of congregated within the groups that I was playing with. So I got to play and meet and see so many great musicians at that time. And that was the great era of fusion in jazz. Yeah. Talking about the early 70s. So groups like Weather Report and Mahavishnu Orchestra and Chick Corea's Return to Forever. These were the bands that I loved at that time, and we were playing a form of fusion at that time as well. So that was my real hard music education period.
Well, it's certainly an evolution if you go from rock and roll to any of the Chick Corea's kind of stuff.
Right. What they were playing at the time was unbelievable. And, his bass player, one of the greats of all time, I think he was 19 years old at the time. So I was learning along with guys that were my contemporaries. And we were all experimenting with this new form of music that Miles Davis really had introduced, the concept of fusing jazz with really rhythm and blues and rock and roll. And I loved it. I thought it was a powerful type of music. It had the dynamics that I loved. It had the power. It spoke to me. And it was popular all around the world. So I found it very ironic that several years later, jazz fusion kind of got a bad reputation and kind of vanished from the scene for a long, long time. One of the things I set out to do in music was to bring it back and keep it going.
Project Grand Slam is literally a fusion in many ways, both musically because you're putting together rock, jazz, Latin music, but also fusing kind of cultures because you have members of a band who are from many different parts of the world. When did that get started?
I first put Project Grand Slam together in 2007. We put out a couple of albums back then. The lineup was very, very different than the lineup today. Mm-hmm. And we were, I would call it a contemporary jazz type of band. The first album was called Play. The second album was called Spring Dance. Had a couple of singles that did nicely on the radio. It was a very nice situation, but the guys that were playing with me in the band at that time were not living in the same location as I was. Sure. One of them was living in Israel, another was living in New Zealand, so it made it a little difficult in order to play gigs. Mm-hmm. And it was a kind of depressing situation for me because I wanted to play live with the band. I let it go for a couple of years, and then in 2015 I made a decision that I was going to reform the band and reform it in several different ways, one of which was, as you just said, I tapped into a group of basically foreign-born musicians that had all come to the United States and come to New York to learn their craft and to make their mark. I jokingly and lovingly call them my international cartel. They're literally from all around the world: Venezuela, Puerto Rico, Cuba, Panama, you name it. But they're all terrific musicians. And I started to write music that was much more oriented towards the way that I was feeling at that time, mm-hmm. which was really to drive that line between rock and jazz, unlike, in my opinion, the way it had been done previously. And each album that we've done since 2015 has kind of honed that in even more. And along the way, because so many of the band members were from Latin American countries, that whole concept of Latin rhythm and the Latin feel got fused into the band as well. So you're right, that's part of the fusion aspect of Project Grand Slam. And also along the way, I started to do something that has become a little bit of a musical signature of mine. And that is, I grew up, as I said, during the whole British invasion era. And I loved all of those bands. And back in 2015, I decided that I wanted to take a song by Jimi Hendrix and kind of make it our own. So we took Fire by Hendrix and we redid it completely. Female vocalist at the time, changed the feel to the whole thing, but it was accepted so well by all the various communities, the critical community as well as the fan community. Mm-hmm. And so the next album, I decided I was going to do something similar. I call it reimagining a song. It's not really a cover. Cover to me is kind of when you do the song just the way it was originally done. I like the idea of taking a song that I love, keeping the essence of it, but reimagining the way that it could be. So you're true to it, but you evolve it and make it your own. So I did the same thing with a song by the Kinks called You Really Got Me. And that worked out very, very nicely. On the next album, we took a song by Cream called I'm So Glad, and we did the same thing. And on the new album, I decided to take a song by a group that was one of my favorites, namely The Who. And we did a PGS version of I Can't Explain.
With reinventing, it's interesting that you even mentioned the Beatles, because most of their early work was reinventing other people's stuff. And then you see those first albums that came across. There's a lot of Motown in there, and things that if you looked back, you go, wait, Mr. Postman, that was done by someone else. I was like, hey, I'm hearing female voices, a trio doing that. What's the scoop? So it's interesting how sometimes you can take something that somebody else did and rework it in a way that's the new improved version of what they had started out with, and end up being the thing that people remember after all the years.
Yeah, 100% correct. All the groups back then started out basically doing covers. They didn't know that they could write music.
Yeah.
The Stones did covers. The Beatles did covers. They all did that. And then, of course, they found their own way. For me, maybe the key moment for all of this was I was one of those 14 million people that claimed to be at Woodstock. Yeah. I was actually at Woodstock. And turns out I was working as a musician in the area that Woodstock was being held in that summer. And like a lot of people, I bought tickets, and it was 3 days, of course. The concert was supposed to take place starting on a Friday night, going through the weekend. Well, I was working in the show band at a hotel in the area. We finished the show that evening on Friday night, and I just waited around with my friends until Saturday morning, because we figured, that they're not going to have music throughout the night. Little did we know that's exactly what they did. And I arrived at Woodstock on Saturday morning at like 6 in the morning, just as Joe Cocker was going on the stage.
Wow.
And if you remember, the sun was bright. It was beautiful. It was a gorgeous day. It was before all the rains came and everything. And Joe Cocker launched into that amazing version of With a Little Help from My Friends, which I always thought was one of the one or two greatest songs that came out of Woodstock. I said to myself at that time, wow, that he took a song that had a certain feel and he completely changed it, but he kept the essence of the song. And I thought it was a marvelous way of doing things. And that stuck in my brain for a number of years.
That brings us fast forward. You have Project Grand Slam has an album releasing later this month, Trippin.
Yes, sir. I've been doing an album each year, and so this is our album for 2018. The name of the album, as you just said, is called Trippin. 11 songs on the album. 10 of them are originals that I wrote. One is the reimagining that I mentioned of The Who's I Can't Explain. The band is really, really tight, really perfected at this point. I have a marvelous crew that I work with, and it includes a wonderful singer named Ziara Washington. And so I decided that I was going to write more vocal tunes. A lot of jazz and jazz-oriented things are mainly instrumental. And my wife said to me a couple of years ago, people like to hear vocals. And I said, I think you're right. And I really, from that, decided as of a couple of years ago, I was going to start to write more vocals. And I hadn't written vocals before that. It's a whole different thought process that goes into writing music when it's vocal music versus instrumental music. But it was a breakthrough for me. And so this album features a bunch of vocal tunes that I think are, again, taking our music and our band into a direction that it hasn't gone before. And it's made it much more amenable to a great number of people. So, for example, we just played a festival in Alabama a couple of weeks ago, and we debuted all of our music from the new album at the festival, and I can honestly say that the crowd's reaction was spectacular.
Nice.
In fact, they called us back for several encores, and we ran out of tunes to play that had been rehearsed by the band, so we kind of winged it at that point. So the new album is coming out in about 10 days or so on the 29th of June. I'm very, very excited about it. And then we go off and play about half a dozen festivals over the summer. We're playing 2 festivals in Michigan, one called Rhythm and Rhymes on the 21st of July. It's a free festival, by the way, in Southfield, Michigan. We're playing another festival in Michigan at the end of the summer on August 26th, which is called the Shoreline Jazz Festival. It's a big, big festival, big headliners. In between, we're playing in Connecticut, free concert in Ridgefield, Connecticut. We're playing at the Mayo Performing Arts Center in Morristown, New Jersey. And we have our 2 first European festivals. We're playing at the Silda Jazz Festival in Norway in early August, followed immediately thereafter by the Nisville Jazz Festival in Nice, Serbia. So not too many bands go from Norway to Serbia on their tour, but we're going to do that.
The best place to find out what you guys have going on is projectgrandslam.com, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes, absolutely correct. We're very active on Facebook, so if you go to facebook.com/projectgrandslam, everything is out there as well.
Now, I would be remiss, and as you know, most of the bass community has a touch of that contagious disease, gear acquisition syndrome. So we like to know how people are getting their sound. Tell us, how are you getting your sound?
I wish I could tell you. I'm not nearly as technical as so many of my colleagues on the bass. Mm-hmm. I've been playing the same bass as my main instrument for the last 25 years. It's a Padula, 4-string bass. It's one of their buzz basses, and I guess the main thing I did, I didn't alter it in any way. It's the original bass. The only thing that I've done that's a little bit different is I use fretless-oriented Padula strings as opposed to the strings that they make for their fretted basses. Mm-hmm. And it gives me kind of a little bit more of a fretless, kind of smoother type of sound. Personally, when I play, both on record and live, I like a very distinctive sound for the bass. I don't like that kind of mushy on the bottom where you can kind of feel it but not really hear it distinctly, that kind of sound. I like, and because the bass is so prominent in what we do, because I write all the music, I'm oriented towards the bass, I'm oriented towards the lines that I write. I want them to come through. So I find that the Padula works out very well for me. I typically play the Padula through, one of several different heads, and I like to have a bottom that I use, the speaker bottom, that's got 4 10-inch speakers. I find that again, gives me that mid-range type of attack that I like. The other instrument that I use, and I did use it on one song on the new album, I am very lucky. A million years ago, I bought a 1960 Fender Precision bass. And I bought it in a pawn shop for $100. I kid you not. It was around the early 1970s, and I've had this bass ever since. And I kind of play with it at home, and I fiddle with it, but it doesn't have that brightness, that distinctiveness. It's got a whole different sound. It's got that Fender sound. Sure. But one of the songs on the new album that I wrote is called 1972. Why? Because when I was writing this song, it's an instrumental. The melody is like right out of the early 70s. The feel is right out of the early 70s. It was that time when, Stevie Wonder was doing his thing. It had that synthesizer, funky kind of feel. Mm-hmm. And I said, there's only one instrument that I can play on that tune. It's got to be my Fender. So I brought it in, and that's the Fender on that one.
Gotcha. That track particularly caught my attention with the funkiness of it. So right off the bat, I'm going, okay, we got some funk.
Well, the funny part, just a little side story is, I told you all my guys are from other countries. Mm-hmm. So when I brought that track, that song to be played at the first time at rehearsal, I said to the guys, and particularly to the keyboard player, I said, I want you to get that Stevie Wonder synthesizer, funky kind of sound. Mm-hmm. I said, I'm sure you probably don't know what I'm talking about because, he grew up in Venezuela. Yeah. And I said, well, here's a couple of things. Go listen to this. He says, no, man. He says, I grew up with this stuff. I know exactly what you're talking about. And boom, he hit it right away.
Yeah.
So, it's worldwide. What can I say?
Absolutely. Well, and interestingly enough, one of the great things about music is because it's a universal language, no matter where you are, you can really dig what's coming from other places. And for the longest time, and as the British invasion affected music in the United States, there was a whole bunch of American music that has affected the rest of the world. And Latin America in particular has had a huge exposure of music like Stevie Wonder. The Brazilians are huge on rock, and they will do heavy metal and they sing in English. And you're kind of going, where's this coming from? And this is definitely not Brazilian, but it is part of that evolution of the music, right?
Definitely. In fact, one of the things I get a kick out of, nowadays on Facebook, on our website, etc., you can figure out where people are coming from that are accessing your site or your music or your page. Mm-hmm. And we have an enormous following, relatively speaking, in places like Mexico and Brazil. Mm-hmm. And you're right, the music is not necessarily what I would have guessed they would be oriented to, but who am I to second guess it? They're there.
Sure.
I also find that when we play, we've been very fortunate. We've played before a number of different audiences. We've opened for everybody from Blues Traveler to Boney James and Mindy Abair, mm-hmm. Yes. And regardless of the audience that we're playing before, because, if you're opening, the people that are there are not really there to hear you. They're there to hear the headliner. Mm-hmm. So we get a wide range of audiences that we open for. And yet every single audience we've ever opened for, not only have we done well, but they relate to the Hendrix stuff, the King stuff, the Cream stuff that we do. We even do a song that's a reimagined Fish song.
Very nice.
Okay? And people just dig it. I think that people like good music no matter what it is, if it's played well. And we also, we have fun when we play. We enjoy what we're doing. The band is tight as can be. I think that comes across also.
Well, Robert, we appreciate you sharing all of this information. Folks, we've been following Project Grand Slam. You've seen on Bass Musician Magazine multiple posts when they're opening for Grammy-nominated artists, when they've got a new album coming out, all kinds of stuff. And, of course, you're going to see this interview, too. So now you've had a chance to meet Robert, and you know what the bass power behind the band is. So make sure you stay on top of what's going on. If they're coming to a venue near you, sounds like there's a lot of free shows that would be just a question of showing up if it's close to you. ProjectGrandSlam.com or Facebook, Project Grand Slam. Find out, go there, check them out, cheer them on, support a fellow bassist in the community. It's all superb stuff, man. Folks, you've seen him here. Robert Miller from Robert Miller's Project Grand Slam, coming to you live on Bass Musician Magazine.
Thanks for bassing out with us here on BassMusicianMagazine.com.